A very good morning to each and every one of you. I hope that you're doing well. It's so good to see you here this morning. Thank you so much for being here for our first gathering. This week we are wrapping up the series that we've been covering the last 8 weeks on the book of Nehemiah. And we've been calling this series Restoring Goodness, a journey in exploring what does it mean for us to become the kind of agents for good in the world where God has placed us. And last week we looked at the chapters leading up to the end of the book of Nehemiah. We said that Nehemiah chapter 1 all the way to chapter 6 is the story of the rebuilding of the wall. And basically by chapter 6, the rebuilding of the wall is done. But the book continues for 7 more chapters, and essentially chapter 1 to chapter 6 is the training wheels. They were rebuilding the wall so that God could engage in rebuilding the hearts of the people. And last week we looked at the first part of what God was doing in rebuilding the hearts of the people, where the people came together, engaged in scripture, and they responded to God's word. And we said that essentially the book of Nehemiah should have ended in Nehemiah chapter 12. By Nehemiah chapter 12, verse 44, what is happening is the people are celebrating. They are standing on the sides of the wall, and there is singing and rejoicing. And if it was a good fairy tale, we could have ended with the words, and they lived happily ever after. But Nehemiah does not end in chapter 12. We still have one more chapter to close. By the end of chapter 12, all the loose ends have been tied up. The people are happy. But then something happens that is unexpected in Nehemiah chapter 13. Have you ever watched a good movie or a good series, and then all the first couple of episodes were good, but then the last episode ends in such a way that you're very disappointed? Or maybe you are a sports fan, and yesterday you were watching the Rugby World Cup, and you were cheering for New Zealand. I'm so sorry. And South Africa won by 1 point, and you went to bed feeling some kind of way on the inside. That's how Nehemiah chapter 13 leaves us feeling. Because the final episodes of Nehemiah chapter 13 are filled with a lot of turbulence, and they're filled with antagonism. They're filled with this sense that all that Nehemiah had done sort of comes to a grinding halt. It ends at a cliffhanger. Let's read together a couple of verses in Nehemiah chapter 13 and look at what God has to teach us. Nehemiah chapter 13 from verse 6 to 11. We're going to read 6 to 11, 15 to 18, and then 23 to 25. Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 6 to 11. But while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Remember that Nehemiah in chapter 2, verse 6, tells us that when he went to see the king, he told the king that at a particular time I am going to come back and continue with my responsibilities as cupbearer. So Nehemiah tells us what happened, what we're going to read happened while he had gone back to his roles, to his responsibilities as cupbearer. And so he said he had returned to the king. Sometime later, I asked his permission and came back to Jerusalem. Here, I learned about the evil thing Eliashib had done in providing Tobiah a room in the courts of the house of God. Guess who's back? Back again. Tobiah. And he's been given a room in the house of God. I was greatly displeased and threw all of Tobiah's household goods out of the room. I gave orders to purify the room and then put back in them the equipment of the house of God with the grain offerings and the incense. Verse 10, I also learned that the portion assigned to the Levites had not been given to them, and that all the Levites and the musicians responsible for the service of God had gone back to their own fields. So I rebuked the officials and asked them, why is the house of God neglected? Then I called them together and stationed them at their posts. Verse 15 to 18. In those days, I saw the people of Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in grain, loading it on donkeys together with the wine, grapes, figs, and all other kinds of loads. And they were bringing all these things to Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Therefore, I warned them against selling food on that day. People from Tyre who had lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kinds of merchandise and selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah. I rebuked the nobles of Judah and said to them, "What is this wicked thing that you are doing, desecrating the Sabbath? Didn't your ancestors do the same things so that God brought calamity on them and on us, calamity on us and on this city? Now you're stirring up more wrath against Israel by desecrating the Sabbath." Verse 23 to 25. Moreover, in those days, I saw the men of Judah who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod the language of one of the other peoples, and did not know how to speak the language of Judah. I rebuked them and called curses on them. I beat some of them and pulled their hair. I made them take an oath in God's name and said, "You are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or for yourselves." The end of God's reading. You see, Nehemiah had started out his campaign to redeem and restore the city of Judah with so much enthusiasm and excitement. He was doing this with vigor because he was hoping that by rebuilding the wall and by rebuilding the people's hearts, that something inside of them was going to change once and for all, and that they were going to live out the purposes that God had for them as a people. But the Word of God doesn't give us a two-dimensional fairy tale picture of how the story of Nehemiah ends. We see in chapter 13, what we see in chapter 13 is that after Nehemiah left the city of Jerusalem, the people forgot all the commitments that they had made. We read last week in chapter 10, the people had made a commitment that they were not going to neglect the temple and the house of God. Nehemiah chapter 10, verse 35 and verse 38. The people had made a commitment that we are going to take care of God's house, that we are going to become the kind of people who are responsible for leaning in and acting towards the temple in such a way that the kingdom, the purposes of God are going to be accomplished. But the people forget that commitment and they go back to making the temple just another common place. It was so bad that a foreigner, Tobiah, remember him from chapter 3 and 4, the guy who was causing a lot of problems for them when they were building the wall. This time he's moved in. He has an apartment there. They've built him a green room, you know, one of those celebrity places where he could, and he's moved his stuff into the temple. And if you know anything about what the temple represented for the people of God, the temple was the center of not just their religious life, it was the center of their social life, their economic life. Basically, what happened in the temple was a picture of what their lives were looking like spiritually. And in this chapter, we see that the spiritual lives of the people are broken down again. That the commitment that they made, they were not able to keep. We see that the people who had committed to keep the Sabbath, going back to chapter 10, verse 31, the people who had committed to keep the Sabbath and to maintain it and to maintain the rights that they were supposed to do to rest on the Sabbath because they were not like the nations around them, all of a sudden, are now participating in not just working on the Sabbath, but they're doing trade, commerce, all the things that they had said about the economy and how they were to live differently. They're no longer doing those things. They've fallen through on their commitment. And the same thing as a people. Their marriages were to be a symbol for the nations around them of what God had designed relationship for. Their marriages were supposed to be a symbol. Their family life was supposed to be something that modeled for the people around them how God had designed all of their lives to be like. And they had committed in Nehemiah chapter 10, as we read last week, they had said, you know what, we're not going to take wives for ourselves or for our sons, and we're not going to take the daughters of the people for ourselves, because as a people, we are going to reflect God's purposes in our relationships. And I wonder if you've seen this pattern in your own life, where you make 2 steps forward and then you take 3 steps back. Where you make 2 steps forward, you're thinking, you know what, this is the time I finally break this thing. I am not going to shout at my child once again. And then the following day, I'm not going to do that thing. I'm not going to make those things happen the way that they're supposed to, the way that they're not supposed to. And then you find yourself doing the same thing. And it's almost like all the things that Nehemiah had done, all of a sudden, leave him asking himself, was I just doing this? Was this a work of just a temporary work that I was doing? Or is there something more that needs to happen? You see, we see from this story that the commitment of the people was not enough to keep them for the purposes that God had for them. We see that even good leadership, inspired leadership, divine leadership from Nehemiah was not enough to get the people where they needed to be. We see that them moving from the Persian kingdom and coming back to Jerusalem, having security around their walls, was not enough for the people to live the way that God had designed them. And sometimes we say, you know what, if only I could change the environment around which I am operating, then I'm going to be different. If only someone different was leading this team or was running things in our nation, if only someone different was changing things, then we are going to be a different people. If only something on the outside changed, or if only I was committed enough. If I was only committed enough to the things that I said I was going to do, then something would change. But this story, this chapter of Nehemiah reminds us that though our commitment is good, though inspired leadership is good, though the design and changing the external circumstances is good, none of those things are enough to sustain us for the life that God has for us. You see, as much as the people received and responded to God's call in Nehemiah chapter 8 all the way to chapter 12, in chapter 13 we see that the people fail because they suffer the same paradox that all of us do. That in our own lives, a lot of the things that we work for goodness seem to be like sand castles. We discover that no matter how hard we work, no matter how tall we build, no matter how wide we make things, that everything is fragile. That things are so terribly temporary that many of the things that we do are not built to last. That we are working in sand. That sometimes people in our lives come and go. We find that we have to do things over and over. We have to find ways to renew our energy in order to keep the work of goodness going. And this is what we see from Nehemiah. He comes back to Jerusalem, and when he finds things are broken down, he doesn't say, you know what, I tried my best. I tried, but look, this workplace, it's so rotten. I tried my best, but look at my family, it's so broken down. I tried my best, but you know what? I don't seem to get where I desire to go. Instead, we see from the life of Nehemiah that we must always find new energy to apply to the broken places of our lives in order to see them flourish into God's goodness. We see from his own life that in order to keep a positive attitude, in order to not get frustrated by the futility of doing the work of goodness, that we always have to find in our own lives energy to go back again and to repeat the work, because the work is never quite finished, even if it can be quite repetitive. That the work is never quite finished. You're never done parenting. You're never done building that business. You're never done engaging in the work of working alongside people in your life to see the goodness of God happen, to see them walk in God's design, to see them come alive in the love of God. For the people to be able to meet and to accomplish what God had for them, we see that something else had to happen. And the story of Nehemiah leaves us hanging. If you were to read the story of Nehemiah, if you were to read the scriptures chronologically, the story of Nehemiah would come at the very end of the Old Testament. Basically, this was the last story we hear of the people of Israel before the coming of a promised Messiah. That what the people needed was not a new commitment to do the things that God wanted for them. What they needed was not to psych themselves up. Instead, what they needed was new hearts that could truly respond to God's love with grateful, obedient devotion. That was what the people needed. But Nehemiah could not produce inside of them that change of heart. Nehemiah was unable to renew the hearts for the people. And in the last statement that he says in Nehemiah chapter 13, Nehemiah says, "Remember me, Lord, for the good I have done." And it leaves us asking ourselves, what needs to happen in order for everlasting goodness to come into the spaces of our lives? Because it seems from the life of Nehemiah that, you know what, even if we are constantly working, we are finding new energy, that we need something more in order to come into our lives, in order for us to experience the goodness that we seek. And this is the purpose of the story of Nehemiah. The story is a setup for us. It's a setup to invite us to lean deeper into the hope that the entire scriptures carry in the person of Jesus. That the goodness we seek, that the purposes that we desire to see come alive in our lives, in the lives of those around us, and in the spaces we find ourselves in, the full realization of those things happened only when God came and entered personally into the human story. And through the story of Jesus, through his life, death, and resurrection, he models for us what it means for us to live a life that is captured in the purposes of God. And through the gift of the Spirit, he is able to renew our hearts to be caught up in that story. And so Jesus enters the story, and we're told that Jesus said in his first reading from the scroll of Isaiah that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim the good news. He has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom to the prisoners and the recovery of sight to the blind. He has sent me to set the oppressed free and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Jesus says, I am the vine to which your life must be connected. I am the gate through which you walk. I am the light of the world who establishes the goodness that you seek. And that the goal of our entire lives is not to be caught up in our commitments. Instead, our goal is to be caught up in a life of communion with the one who never fails in his commitments. You see, unless our lives are caught up in that story of communion with Christ, then all our good endeavors end up where Nehemiah's endeavors ended. They end up with us asking ourselves, was what I did enough for my family? Was what I did enough for this business? Was what I did enough for the people around me to help them to see the goodness of God? Nehemiah's story leaves us where the road is finished, there's no more to be done, and we have to ask ourselves, are we caught up in the story of the person who was able to accomplish all of that in communion with him? Not just commitment, in communion with him, because through his Spirit, he's able to produce in us the kind of change we could never produce in ourselves. And so 3 things for us to take away from this story. Number 1, what are the stories that are tempting us and drawing us out of the place of restoring goodness? You see, what Nehemiah chapter 13 tells us is that whatever we're engaged in, there will always be stories that are tempting us to pull away, to drift away from that work of goodness. It could be old enemies like Tobiah coming back into the story. It could be stories in our culture about ways of doing life that are not in harmony, in alignment with God, like the men of Judah marrying the women of Moab and Ashdod. It could be things in our own spaces where we have begun to find ways to step outside and to navigate our stories, but to mix them in with something that makes sense to us. What are the stories that are pulling us away from the work of goodness that we need to be involved in? And we need to pay attention to those things so that we can always come back to the place of God's story for us. And if you were to look into your own life, into your own spaces, wherever it is that there is a work of goodness going on, you will find stories tempting you away from that work. It could be distractions, small things, saying, you know what, you don't need to spend a lot of time there. You don't need to pray together as a family. It's not that serious. You don't need to actively continue to fight for the good, the injustice that is going on. What are those stories? Because you see, what needs to happen in our life is for us to catch ourselves, to develop an awareness for those things, and then to find renewed strength to work. Number 2, What are the symbols? What are the rhythms in our lives that remind us of the patterns of goodness that we need to get caught up in? You see, our life is a collection of rhythms and patterns. All of us are playing the same rhythms and songs in our lives. We might be doing it unconsciously or consciously. And the question is, what are the rhythms that are guiding and shepherding the stream of your life and weaving together the fabric of where you are finding yourself? Because God invites us into particular rhythms. And we've seen some of them from the story of Nehemiah's life, drawing us into spaces of prayer in our lives, drawing us into spaces of engaging with Scripture as the work of formation for us, drawing into the work of community together, participating not because we are experts, but because we are invited and we are called into that work. You see, as we engage in those rhythms, that becomes the work of formation in our lives. And that work of formation becomes the thing that shapes who we become. And it becomes the thing that shapes the work that we do. And then lastly, we need to be engaged in stories and engaged in symbols and rhythms. And then lastly, we need to be reminded to engage in communion. When I read this chapter, I was very disappointed because I thought, you know what? Nehemiah sets up such a good leadership model. But if you look at the final part as we were reading in chapter 23 to 25, you see, Nehemiah is just like us. He gets so frustrated, he needs to beat people, and he's just like pulling their hair. Tell me the level of frustration you need to be at for you to be engaging in that particular way. You see, Nehemiah got to the place that all of us get in our own lives. He got to the end of himself. He got to the end of all that he could do by himself. And the work of communion reminds us that when we are at the end of ourselves, that there is one who meets us and never gets to the end. There is one who meets us to renew us, to encourage us, to inspire us, to pour into our own spirits his spirit, to enable us to keep going. So I don't know what places in your own life you have found yourself at the end of yourself. And where do you go when you find yourself at the end of yourself? Because in Matthew chapter 16, we're told that Jesus, in his final moments with his disciples, sat with them around a table. And at that table, he demonstrated to them where they were to go when they got to the end of themselves. He said, you see, this is my body, and it's going to be broken for you. And it's going to be broken so that as it is broken, you can look into all the spaces that are broken in life, and you can see my fingerprints, my work continuing in spite of anything else that is going on. This is my blood poured out for you, for the forgiveness of sins, that we can always find renewal at the table. And so today, as we celebrate communion, the reminder for all of us, as we come to the end of Nehemiah, as we come to the end of ourselves, is to be reminded that there is one who is more than enough for all of us. There is one who never gets to the end. There is one who is always ready to meet us. That when we find ourselves looking for new strength to keep going in our own homes, to keep going in the things that we do outside our homes, to keep going in the spaces we struggle on the inside, that there is reason for us to find new hope in those spaces.